During the wedding rehearsal, my daughter whispered, "No speaking tonight." I folded the toast I wrote, slipped it into my shoe, and then I sat back down as though her words hadn't pierced me through the chest. The paper was still warm from my hand, a little damp where my palm had sweated against it while I waited for my turn. I had spent 3 nights rewriting those words, trimming them down so they wouldn't embarrass her, softening my humor so it wouldn't sound sharp, practicing in front of the kitchen sink where the faucet's reflection was the only witness. And now, with one whispered sentence, all of it was dismissed, folded away, hidden under the arch of my foot like something shameful. I smiled, at least I tried to. The other parents, relatives, and friends were taking their turns at small remarks, chuckles, little toasts that weren't really toasts but gestures of inclusion. I kept my mouth shut, nodding at the right moments, my eyes fixed on the flicker of candles set out for the rehearsal dinner. My daughter's voice was still echoing inside me, not loud but sharp, like the hiss of steam escaping a kettle you thought you'd turned off. "No speaking tonight." She hadn't even looked at me as she said it. Her gaze had been locked on the groom, on the tidy table where his parents sat proud and confident, their words welcomed like gifts. Mine was not. Mine had to be tucked away where no one would trip over it. The hardest part was pretending it hadn't happened. That's what mothers do, isn't it? We make the world smoother than it is, we plaster over the cracks so no one else has to feel the sting. I watched her lift her glass with the groom, her laugh bright and effortless, the kind of laugh that never reached me anymore. I remember when it used to, when she was little and her laughter would curl around me like sunlight, when her jokes were for me first before anyone else. But years had passed, and somewhere along the way I had become a shadow in the room she occupied. Needed, but not invited. Present, but not permitted. I tapped my shoe against the floor, feeling the outline of the folded toast pressing into my arch. I could almost recite it by the rhythm of that pulse. I had written about her freckles, the ones she hated as a child but I adored, because they reminded me of constellations no one else had discovered. I had written about the way she once clutched my fingers in the grocery store aisle, too afraid to let go even when she pretended she wasn't. I had kept it short, respectful, nothing that would embarrass her or reveal too much. Just a thread of love she could pull on if ever she felt lost. But none of that would be heard. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. The evening blurred into small speeches, clinks of glass, bursts of laughter. I smiled when expected, kept my voice quiet when I needed to answer questions. My daughter avoided my eyes, or maybe I avoided hers, I couldn't tell. By the time dessert came, my throat had dried so tight I couldn't have spoken even if she had asked me to. My toast remained crumpled in my shoe, and I walked out with it still there, the paper softened by the heat of my foot, the words bleeding into one another as though they were ashamed of themselves. When I got home that night, I didn't take it out. I left it tucked under the insole, a hidden wound I wasn't ready to face. I boiled water for tea I didn't drink, set my phone on the counter without looking at it, and sat in the dark kitchen with my hands clasped tight in my lap. That's when the weight of it finally settled, not just the rejection of the toast, but the rejection of me. Because that's what it felt like, if I am being honest. Not that she didn't want a speech, but that she didn't want my speech. Not my voice, not my presence in the way it once mattered. The house was quiet, but in my chest there was a noise I couldn't silence, like glass breaking over and over again. It wasn't about words on a page. It was about being told to fold myself smaller, to tuck myself away so no one else would be uncomfortable. That night, I opened the drawer where I kept old photographs. There was one of her at 6, sitting on the back steps with scraped knees and a melting popsicle, her eyes locked on mine, full of trust. I held that picture like it might remind me who I used to be to her, but all it did was remind me of the distance I could never close again. I wish I could say I fell asleep quickly, that exhaustion took me. But I didn't. I sat awake, staring at the ceiling, the echo of her words filling the space between the ticking of the clock. And when dawn came, I put on my shoes with the folded toast still inside. I told myself I would keep it there, not out of hope anymore, but as a reminder. A reminder of silence, of being silenced. I walked through the morning, through errands and polite conversations, all the while with her voice under my foot, a sting I carried step by step. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe because some part of me was stubborn, some part that refused to let it be erased completely. Maybe because I couldn't bring myself to throw away the only words I had left to give her. All I know is that as the days crept toward the wedding, the weight of that hidden paper became heavier than anything I had carried in years. And with each passing day, I began to wonder if silence was really what she wanted, or if it was just what I had always been too willing to give. The next morning, I stood at the counter buttering a piece of toast I didn't want to eat, listening to the kettle whistle like it was scolding me. The folded speech still sat inside my shoe, pressed flat now, its corners softened by each step I took around the house. I thought about pulling it out, smoothing it, maybe even reading it aloud just to the silence. But something inside me refused. If she didn't want to hear it, then perhaps no one would. Not even the walls that had kept my secrets for decades. I told myself I was overreacting. Mothers do that, don't they? We read too much into short sentences, we bleed too much from paper cuts. Maybe she hadn't meant it as cruelly as it landed. Maybe she was nervous, overwhelmed, worried about appearances. I tried to give her that grace, because I knew weddings weren't really about mothers. They were about daughters becoming wives, sons-in-law taking center stage, families merging in a carefully orchestrated dance. My role was to stay in the background, to smile when called upon, to help iron out the wrinkles no one else wanted to touch. That's what I told myself. But still, when I buttered that toast, I felt the sting of being silenced all over again. The wedding week unfolded in a blur of errands and tasks. I drove to pick up dresses, I called the florist when she forgot to confirm the order, I ironed napkins because the caterer had delivered them folded wrong. Every time a small crisis flared, I was the one to fix it, and I did it quietly. That was my way of showing love, solving the things no one else even noticed. But even as I moved through each task, her whisper echoed. No speaking tonight. It began to feel less like a request and more like a boundary line I wasn't supposed to cross. At the rehearsal brunch, the groom's mother handed out place cards for the dinner. She spoke with that kind of confidence women acquire when they've never been told their voices were too much. Every suggestion she made was welcomed, folded into the plan without hesitation. I sat across the table, folding my napkin into neat lines, careful not to let my opinion slip. When someone asked what color the ribbon was for the bouquets, I knew the answer. I had been the one to collect them from the florist, but I held my tongue until no one else spoke. Only then did I quietly say, "It's ivory." My daughter nodded but didn't look at me. The groom's mother patted my hand as though I'd finally done something useful. I smiled, but inside I felt the hollow echo of a woman shrinking. That night, I took a walk around my neighborhood just to escape the noise inside my own head. The street lamps cast soft circles of light, and the air smelled faintly of cut grass and someone else's barbecue. I found myself thinking back to my own wedding, the way my mother had stood tall at the reception, speaking proudly about me even though her voice trembled. She hadn't asked permission. She hadn't waited for someone else to grant her space. She had taken it, because it was hers to take. I realized then that my folded toast wasn't just words, it was a piece of me, a piece of the woman I used to be, buried under layers of silence I had accepted too easily. The days grew tighter as the wedding drew closer. Everywhere I went, I carried the hidden toast in my shoe, and with every step I felt the quiet rebellion of it pressing into my skin. It reminded me that I hadn't completely vanished, no matter how invisible I felt. I began to notice the small ways I had been erasing myself, letting conversations pass without adding my thoughts, declining invitations because I didn't want to be in the way, dressing in muted colors so no one would notice me too much. My daughter's whisper hadn't created this silence, it had only shone a harsh light on the silence I'd already been living in. 2 nights before the wedding, I found myself alone in the kitchen again. The counters were cluttered with lists and receipts, the kind of organized chaos that always precedes celebrations. I pulled out a wine glass, poured myself half a glass of red, and sat at the table with the folded toast finally in my hand. The paper was soft, the ink smudged from sweat and pressure, but the words were still there. I read them aloud, quietly, my voice unsteady. I spoke of freckles in grocery aisles, of scraped knees and constellations. I spoke of the love that had carried me through years of sacrifice, years of waiting, years of being the net that caught her falls. And when I finished, I sat in the silence of my kitchen and realized something: the words weren't for her anymore. They were for me. I had written them because I needed to remember who I was in her story. Not a shadow, not a background figure, but the first voice she ever heard, the first hand she ever held. She could choose not to hear them now, but that didn't erase their truth. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt the faintest flicker of power return to me. Small, fragile, but real. The morning of the wedding rehearsal dinner, I slipped the toast back into my shoe out of habit. But when I stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the wrinkles out of my dress, I looked at myself with new eyes. I saw a woman who had spent too long apologizing for taking up space. I saw lines on my face that told stories no one else could tell, and a quiet strength in my posture I hadn't noticed before. For once, I didn't wish to disappear. I wanted to be seen, even if only by myself. At the dinner, laughter bubbled around the room, glasses clinked, and toasts flew freely. The groom's father told a long, winding story about his son's first fishing trip. The groom's mother spoke about the family traditions they hoped to carry forward. My daughter beamed, radiant, her hand clasped with the man she had chosen. When my eyes met hers, I didn't expect an invitation. But I also didn't feel the ache of waiting for one. I sat quietly, not silence this time, but steady in the knowledge that my words existed, even if they weren't spoken aloud. They were mine, and they mattered, whether or not anyone else gave them room. And as I tapped my foot against the floor, feeling the faint outline of the paper inside my shoe, I realized something even more surprising: I no longer needed to read it to her. I needed to live it for myself. The morning of the wedding broke warm and bright, the kind of day people like to call perfect. The sky was a deep, unapologetic blue, the air carried that subtle sweetness that only lingers at the end of summer, and the neighbors' yards already looked as though they were celebrating something even before we had begun. I woke early, not from nerves but from habit, and found myself staring at the ceiling long after the alarm had chimed. My heart beat in a way I couldn't explain, too fast for calm, too slow for panic, caught in some in-between rhythm that felt as unsettled as I was. I slipped my feet into the shoes I had set out the night before. The folded toast was still there, flattened so thin now that it was almost part of the insole. I felt it immediately, not painful, just present, like a reminder that even silence leaves traces. I told myself I should finally take it out, but my hands refused. Instead, I wore it like armor, though it wasn't the kind anyone else could see. The house filled quickly with movement. Hair sprayed into place, voices calling for missing cufflinks, the scent of coffee colliding with perfume. I moved through it like a shadow, tidying, fetching, smoothing. When my daughter came down the stairs, she was glowing in her robe, her hair pinned back with small pearls, her smile wide enough to stop me in my tracks. For one suspended moment, I forgot everything. I saw only the little girl who once tiptoed into my bed after nightmares, who had pressed sticky popsicle kisses onto my cheek without hesitation. But the moment was short. She barely glanced at me as the makeup artist swooped in, her laughter spilling toward her bridesmaids instead. I stood aside, clutching a mug of tea I no longer wanted, and told myself that this was how it was supposed to be. Daughters outgrow their mothers. They turn away, they turn toward. Still, a part of me ached, as though some invisible thread had been pulled tight enough to fray. At the church, guests poured in with the usual rustle of excitement, shoes tapping against marble, whispers tumbling down the aisles like scattered leaves. I sat where I was told to sit, smoothing my dress over my knees, watching the space fill with bodies and voices. The groom's family took their seats across from us, their smiles wide, their energy bright, as though they were the hosts of the day instead of us. His mother looked resplendent in a navy gown that sparkled under the light, and when she turned, I caught the way several guests leaned in to compliment her. I pulled at the hem of my own dress, suddenly conscious of its muted color, its modest lines. I hadn't wanted to outshine my daughter, but now I wondered if I had made myself too invisible. When the music began, everything else dissolved. My daughter walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her veil catching the light like spun glass. I should have felt pride swelling inside me, and some part of me did, but it was braided tightly with something else, a quiet grief that she was walking away, that the little girl with the popsicle and the scraped knees was being folded into a new life where I was no longer central. I clapped with everyone else when she reached the altar, but my hands stung, as though even the act of celebration carried a cost. The ceremony passed in a blur, the vows, the rings, the promises spoken with trembling voices. I held my breath through most of it, afraid that if I exhaled I might make a sound I couldn't control. When they kissed, the church erupted in applause, and I clapped again, smiling because that's what was expected. But deep inside, I felt the folded toast burning against my foot, as though it were reminding me of all the words I had swallowed that day, and for years before. At the reception, the room glittered with flowers and candlelight, laughter rising like steam. The tables were draped in ivory, the silverware gleaming in neat alignment, the glasses already fogging from champagne. I sat at my place, hands folded neatly in my lap, waiting for the inevitable moment. The toasts. The voices raised in tribute. My daughter and her new husband at the center, glowing as though the world had shifted to revolve solely around them. And then, as the first glass was lifted, I felt my stomach twist. The groom's father spoke first, telling stories that drew easy laughter, his voice booming with confidence. His wife followed, her words perfectly polished, her anecdotes charming and warm. One by one, the bridal party spoke, bridesmaids with rehearsed humor, groomsmen with practiced sincerity. The room swelled with applause after each speech, a tide of approval washing easily toward them. And me? I sat silent, my smile fixed, my foot tapping the folded toast against the floor like a private metronome. I had never been invited to speak, and now I knew I never would be. When the laughter died down and the music started again, I excused myself. I slipped out onto the terrace, where the air was cooler and quieter. The garden stretched out, dotted with lanterns, the night sky heavy with stars. I leaned against the railing, my body trembling though the air was still. I thought of my mother again, of her trembling but unwavering voice at my wedding. I thought of how small I had allowed myself to become, waiting for permission that never came. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. Just a quiet click, like a lock opening. I realized that I didn't need her invitation to exist. I didn't need her permission to matter. My words were mine. My presence was mine. My love was mine. She could not erase that, no matter how many times she whispered me into silence. I didn't march back in to make a speech. I didn't demand a spotlight. Instead, I returned to my seat, lifted my glass when the next toast came, and whispered my own words under my breath. No one else heard them, but I did. I toasted her freckles, her scraped knees, her constellations. I toasted the years of holding and letting go. And when the champagne touched my lips, it tasted of salt, as though my own tears had mingled with the bubbles. Later, when the dancing began and the music thundered through the hall, I stayed at the edge of the floor. I watched my daughter twirl in her gown, her laughter ringing like bells. She looked happy, and that mattered more than anything else. But I also let myself feel the ache, the absence, the silence I had been pressed into. I didn't pretend it wasn't there. I carried it openly, quietly, the way you carry a scar. It didn't make me less. It made me real. When the night wound down and the guests began to scatter, I walked to the cloakroom, slipping into my coat with deliberate slowness. My feet ached, not from the shoes but from the paper inside them, now worn soft as cloth. I thought about taking it out, unfolding it one last time. But I didn't. I left it there, carried it home again, step by step. Because somehow, it had become part of me, not a burden anymore, but a reminder. That even silenced words still exist. That even unseen love still burns. That even if no one else listens, I can hear myself. The morning after the wedding, the house felt hollow in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't just quiet, it was emptied out, as though the laughter and footsteps of the previous days had been packed up and carried away with the rented linens and leftover cake. I wandered from room to room without purpose, touching the backs of chairs, smoothing the counter with my palm, as though I were checking for proof that life had actually happened here. It felt impossible that something so large, so full of voices and vows, could leave behind only silence. But it had. Her shoes were still by the door, the pair she had slipped out of before changing into her gown. I picked them up and set them on the shelf, my hands trembling with the weight of such a small task. It struck me then that those shoes wouldn't be returning, they had walked her out of this house and into another. She was no longer mine in the way she had been, and I could not step into her new life no matter how much I wanted to. That realization sat heavy in my chest, like a stone pressing against my lungs. I sat at the kitchen table, my tea cooling untouched beside me. My shoes were still on, and the folded toast was still pressed against my foot. I slipped it out at last, holding the paper in my hands. It was soft now, almost tissue-like, its creases smoothed by days of wear. I read the words again, quietly, my lips barely moving. They no longer stung. They no longer begged to be heard. Instead, they felt like a keepsake, a relic of a time when I still believed my words could bridge the growing distance between us. Now, I wasn't so sure. I thought of calling her. My phone was right there, lit up with notifications from relatives who wanted to gush about the wedding, the photographs, the flowers. I scrolled past them, my thumb hovering over her name. But I didn't press it. I knew her day would be full, her attention divided, her tone polite but distracted. And I realized, painfully, that I no longer wanted to beg for scraps of her attention. I wanted something else. I wanted a place where my voice wasn't an intrusion, where my words didn't have to be folded away. The first week after the wedding, I kept myself busy with the small rituals of putting a house back in order. I returned the borrowed cake stand, dropped linens at the cleaners, mailed off thank you notes I had drafted on her behalf. My daughter called once, her voice cheerful, rushing to tell me about their honeymoon plans, how busy everything was, how quickly life was moving. I listened, I laughed in the right places, I told her I loved her before we hung up. But when I set the phone down, I stared at it for a long time. Her voice hadn't carried any malice, it had carried distance, as though she were already speaking from a life I could only glimpse through a fogged window. By the second week, the stillness began to gnaw at me. For so long, my life had been built around her, her schedules, her meals, her moods, her milestones. Even when she was grown and living on her own, I had measured myself by her orbit. Now that orbit had shifted entirely away from me, and I was left spinning without a center. I tried to fill the hours with chores, with errands, with television droning in the background. But nothing seemed to stick. At night, the silence grew unbearable, pressing against me from the walls. I lay awake listening to the tick of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint whine of wind through the eaves. My body was in the house, but my mind was adrift, searching for something to tether me. One evening, out of habit more than desire, I opened the drawer where I kept old papers. School drawings, birthday cards, scraps of poems I had written in the margins of bills. I sifted through them, touching each one like a prayer bead. Among them, I found a photograph of myself at 25, holding my daughter as a newborn. My hair was longer then, my face fuller, my smile unguarded. I stared at that woman for a long time, realizing how much of her I had misplaced over the years. She had dreams once, independent of motherhood, though I could hardly recall what they were. Somewhere along the way, I had tucked them into a shoe and forgotten to take them out. That night, I did something small but strange. I went to the back of my closet and pulled out a scarf I hadn't worn in years, red, brighter than anything I usually chose. I wrapped it around my neck and looked at myself in the mirror. It startled me, the way the color lit my face, the way it made me look like someone I almost remembered. I laughed quietly at the foolishness of it, but I didn't take it off. I wore it the next morning when I walked to the market, and though no one commented, I felt different. Seen, if only by myself. In the days that followed, I began adding other small rebellions. I poured tea into the blue china cup I usually reserved for guests, as though I were finally worthy of my own best. I bought fresh flowers not for her table, but for mine, arranging them clumsily in a vase that had gathered dust. I walked a different route through the neighborhood, down streets I had never bothered to explore. Each small act felt almost defiant, a refusal to stay folded. Of course, there were setbacks. There were nights when loneliness pressed so heavy that I almost called her, almost begged her to remind me I still mattered. There were mornings when I stood in front of the mirror and saw nothing but age and emptiness staring back. But each time, I forced myself to remember the scarf, the flowers, the tea in the china cup. Small, human actions that reminded me I was still here. That I still had a voice, even if no one else wanted to hear it. By the end of the month, the folded toast sat not in my shoe, but on my nightstand. I had smoothed it flat, pressed it between the pages of a book. It no longer felt like a wound, it felt like a testament. Proof that I had words worth keeping, even if they were only for myself. Sometimes, before bed, I would open the book and read them aloud, not to her, but to the quiet. And the quiet, for the first time, felt like it was listening. One evening, while cleaning the kitchen, I caught myself humming. I froze, startled by the sound. It had been so long since music had slipped out of me without effort. The tune was simple, something half-remembered from years ago, but it filled the room in a way words hadn't in weeks. I laughed softly, shaking my head, but I kept humming. It felt like reclaiming a part of myself I had forgotten existed. The following Sunday, I walked past the church where the wedding had taken place. The doors were closed, the courtyard empty, but I stood there for a long time. I remembered the way my daughter had walked down the aisle, radiant and untouchable. I remembered the applause, the speeches, the silence I had carried. And then I whispered to myself, I was there. It felt important to say it out loud, to claim it. I had been present. My love had been present. My words had been present, even if no one else had let them into the room. As I turned to leave, the wind tugged at my scarf, pulling it across my face like a banner. I let it flutter, bright against the muted street, and for the first time in a long while, I walked with my head lifted. I didn't know what the next weeks would bring, or the next months, but I knew this, I could not keep living folded. The weeks after the wedding stretched longer than I expected. At first, each day felt like another hallway in a house I couldn't quite navigate, too quiet, too spacious, too filled with reminders of what used to be. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the days began to shape themselves into something different. Not better, not yet, but different. And different was enough to keep me moving forward. I started with mornings. For years, my mornings had been hurried affairs, breakfasts to prepare, phone calls to return, errands waiting in a neat row like soldiers demanding attention. Now there was no such line. The emptiness scared me at first. I would sit at the table with my tea and stare at the clock, willing it to move faster. But then one morning, I pulled the curtains wide open and let the sunlight flood in. The light was sharp and honest, cutting across the kitchen in golden lines. I brewed a second cup of tea, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to hold something warm in my hands a little longer. That morning, I decided that I would begin treating mornings as gifts, not as burdens. I took walks. At first, they were short, down the block, around the corner, back again before my absence could be noticed, even though there was no one left to notice. But gradually, the walks lengthened. I discovered a trail I had never explored, winding behind the library and into a pocket of woods where the air smelled of damp earth and pine. One afternoon, I stood still among the trees and realized I couldn't hear a single car, only the rustle of leaves and the call of a bird I couldn't name. For the first time in a long while, I felt small in the best way possible, not insignificant, but part of something larger. I began carrying a notebook with me. At first, I only wrote grocery lists and reminders, but then sentences started appearing unbidden. Observations, memories, fragments of feelings that had no place to go. I wrote about the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, about the woman in the market who always hummed while choosing apples, about the ache that still curled in my chest when I thought of my daughter's whisper. Writing felt like exhaling after years of holding my breath. The folded toast had been the beginning, but this was different. These words were mine alone, not waiting for anyone's approval, not desperate for anyone's ears. One Saturday, I stopped at a small second-hand shop tucked between a laundromat and a cafe. I don't know what drew me inside, but I wandered through the aisles as though searching for something I hadn't yet named. I found a scarf, not red this time, but a soft green that reminded me of spring grass. I bought it without hesitation, and when I wore it the next day, I caught my reflection in a shop window and barely recognized myself. I looked alive. Not younger, not transformed, but undeniably present. That afternoon, while sipping coffee at the cafe next door, I overheard a group of women planning a book club. Their laughter spilled over the table, their voices warm with camaraderie. I sat quietly, pretending to read, but every word lodged itself in me. For years, I had avoided groups like that, telling myself I was too busy, too awkward, too unnecessary. But something inside me stirred. When one of the women passed by my table to throw away her cup, I heard myself say, "That sounds like a wonderful book." She smiled, paused, and asked if I'd like to join them next week. I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. The first meeting terrified me. I wore the red scarf, as though it might lend me courage, and carried my book with trembling hands. But the women welcomed me easily, asking my name, drawing me into their laughter. I spoke sparingly at first, testing the waters, but when one of them asked my opinion on a passage, I found my voice spilling out, shaky but steady. They listened. They nodded. And in that moment, I realized how long it had been since my words had found a place to land. After that, life began to unfurl in ways I hadn't expected. I started visiting the market not just for groceries, but for the small pleasure of talking to the vendors. I bought flowers more often, sometimes arranging them so poorly that I laughed aloud at the result, but it didn't matter. I painted a corner of the kitchen a pale yellow, a color I'd always liked but never dared to choose. Each act was small, but together they formed something larger, a life that was mine, stitched together from threads I had once thought too frayed to use. Of course, my daughter remained a presence, sometimes heavy, sometimes faint. She called once a week, her voice breezy and bright, filled with stories of her new routines. I listened, I encouraged, but I didn't tell her about the book club, or the scarves, or the yellow paint. It wasn't secrecy, exactly. It was ownership. For the first time, I had pieces of myself that belonged only to me. And that felt precious, like holding a fragile bird in my hands. There were still moments of ache. Some nights, I sat by the window and watched the streetlights flicker on, my chest tightening with the memory of her whisper. I wondered if she realized the weight of those words, if she thought of me at all in her new life. I wondered if one day she might regret silencing me, or if I was destined to remain a footnote in her story. But even in those moments, I reminded myself, I was no longer waiting for her to hand me permission to exist. My life did not end at the edge of her approval. One evening, after a particularly lively book club meeting, I walked home under a sky brushed with pink and gold. I thought about my mother again, about the strength it must have taken her to speak at my wedding despite her trembling voice. I wondered if she, too, had felt silenced in ways I had never seen. Perhaps we all inherit a kind of quiet, a generational folding of ourselves, passed down like heirlooms. But standing under that sky, scarf fluttering against my neck, I felt something else, the possibility of breaking the pattern. When I arrived home, I placed fresh flowers on the table and poured myself a glass of wine. I unfolded my notebook and wrote, not about loss this time, but about discovery. I wrote about the trail in the woods, about the laughter of new friends, about the color yellow spilling warmth across my kitchen. I wrote until my hand ached, until the words became a steady hum. And when I finally set the pen down, I felt lighter than I had in months. It struck me then that my daughter's whisper, cruel as it had felt, had been a door closing. But sometimes, doors closing are the only way we notice the windows. And through those windows, a different kind of light pours in, sharp, honest, uninvited, but wholly real. I went to bed that night with the folded toast still tucked in the book by my nightstand. I didn't need to read it anymore. I didn't need to prove anything with it. But I kept it there as a reminder of where silence had taken me, and where my own voice had led me since. And when I turned off the light, I whispered into the darkness, not to her, not to anyone else, but to myself, I am still here. Autumn crept in almost without my noticing. The mornings grew cooler, the trees along the trail blushed into shades of red and gold, and I found myself reaching for scarves without thinking. Life had slipped into a rhythm again, not the rhythm of the years before, when everything turned on my daughter's needs and schedules, but a quieter one, shaped by my own choices. It was fragile, yes, but it was mine. One Saturday, the book club met at the cafe instead of someone's living room. The place smelled of cinnamon and coffee, and the windows fogged from the steam of too many cups. We sat in a circle, talking about passages that had moved us, laughing at characters we found insufferable. When it came time for me to speak, I realized I no longer trembled. My voice was steady, even warm, and the women leaned in to hear me. I left that day with a smile I couldn't quite hide. On the walk home, I realized something startling. I had found a place where my words mattered. They weren't folded into shoes or hidden in drawers. They were spoken, heard, and received. Not long after, my daughter called. Her voice was full of wedding photos, honeymoon stories, little anecdotes about setting up their new apartment. I listened, as always, and she asked polite questions in return. But when I told her about the book club, casually, almost as an afterthought, she paused. You? In a book club? Her tone wasn't unkind, but it was surprised, as though she had forgotten that I could belong anywhere outside her orbit. I laughed softly and told her yes, I had joined, and that I loved it. The silence that followed was brief, but I felt it. Perhaps she was rearranging the image of me in her mind, making space for a version she hadn't considered. We spoke of other things, but I hung up with the faintest flicker of triumph burning in my chest. Still, the ache lingered sometimes. Some nights, lying in bed, I remembered the way she had whispered to me at the rehearsal, "No speaking tonight." It replayed like an echo, softer now, but still sharp. I wondered if she knew what those words had cost me, how they had unraveled something deep inside. I wondered if she would ever understand. Perhaps she wouldn't. Perhaps children aren't meant to. They live forward, not backward, and the sacrifices of their parents fade into background noise unless pointed out. I had pointed it out once, in my silence, and it had been enough. One afternoon, while cleaning out the hall closet, I found a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were old journals, faded letters, photographs with curled edges. At the bottom lay a stack of poems I had written in my 20s, long before motherhood had swallowed me whole. I sat on the floor, dust in my hair, reading them with a strange mix of embarrassment and awe. They weren't brilliant, but they were alive. Full of longing, of hope, of a voice unafraid to speak. That voice had been mine once, and as I read, I realized it could be mine again. That evening, I pulled out my notebook and wrote a poem. Not about my daughter, not about loss, but about the woods behind the library, the way the light sifted through branches like flour through a sieve. I wrote without expectation, without audience, and when I finished, I felt the quiet satisfaction of having built something small but whole. I tucked the poem into the book where I had pressed the folded toast. Two artifacts, side by side, one from the moment I was silenced, the other from the moment I reclaimed my voice. The seasons shifted again. Winter arrived with its sharp winds and early nights, but I no longer dreaded the silence of the house. I filled it with music, with laughter from new friends, with the scratch of pen on paper. My daughter visited once in December, bringing her husband and stories of their first holidays together. She breezed through the house, pointing out how things had changed, the yellow kitchen wall, the scarves draped over the hooks, the flowers bright on the table. "You've been busy," she said, almost teasing. I smiled and told her yes, I had. That evening, as we sat by the fire, she asked if I still had the speech I had written. The question startled me. I looked at her face, glowing in the firelight, and I searched for malice but found none. She seemed curious, even softened. For a moment, I considered fetching it, reading it aloud at last. But then I realized I no longer needed to. The words had done their work. They had kept me company through silence, carried me into discovery, transformed into something more than a speech. They had become a bridge back to myself. So I shook my head gently and said, it wasn't the right time. She looked at me for a moment, then leaned her head on my shoulder. We sat in silence, not the kind that wounds, but the kind that rests. When she left the next morning, I stood at the doorway watching her go, her laughter echoing down the street. The ache was still there, yes, but it no longer hollowed me out. It had become a companion of sorts, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been found. That afternoon, I walked to the woods again. The trees stood bare, their branches like outstretched arms, the ground littered with brittle leaves. I stood still among them, breathing in the cold air, feeling the earth steady beneath my feet. I whispered aloud, not to anyone, not even to myself, but simply into the air, I am here. The words drifted upward, caught in the branches, carried away by the wind. I left the folded toast pressed between the pages of my book at home. I no longer needed to carry it in my shoe, no longer needed to keep it close as proof of my existence. It belonged to the past, but the voice it had given me belonged to the present. And as I walked back through the quiet streets, scarf wrapped tight around my neck, I realized the truth that had taken me so long to learn. Sometimes the most important speeches are the ones no one else hears. They are the words we say to ourselves when the world has turned its face away. They are the words that remind us we are still alive, still worthy, still whole. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and let the silence wrap around me. It was no longer an enemy. It was a companion. It was mine. And in that silence, I poured a cup of tea, opened my notebook, and began to write again.